In Canada, the opioid addiction crisis is addressed by having the taxpayers pay for the heroin, and that's called the safe supply. And no, I'm not joking. While heroin addiction is, in effect, subsidized, having a cigarette or drinking a beer with your pals is effectively criminalized. More recently, the Canadian police can quite literally get into your house without a warrant under the probable cause that you might have had a drink while driving. It doesn't matter that you're not driving right now. In other news, the New York Times, a former newspaper, is in the business of advocating institutionalized sexist discrimination. Against men, of course, because women are special. Meanwhile, far leftists all over the world have been busy exerting violence against the Brazilian embassies, all of them claiming to be triggered by the ascension of Jair Bolsonaro. But don't say this is a world communism operation, because then you'll be labeled a conspiracy theorist. And finally, the project Pedophilia is going on just fine. Now it's mainstream to photograph prepubescent children with naked adults in sexual circumstances and publish that on Twitter. It's all good. Just don't tell journalists to learn to code, and don't post NPC memes, because that is haram. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the 25th installment of Periodic Insanity. Now, I haven't done an episode of this since, I guess, August last year or something like that, and I only collected links just from 2019, and I already have material for at least 3 episodes. Anyway, let's dive in, because there's a lot of insanity going on. First one comes from New Zealand, but it's about Brazil. The Wellington Scoop, Brazilian embassy occupied in protest against new president. And it's basically the press statement of the far-left group that did it, because that's what the Wellington Scoop understands to do. Scoop, by simply copy-pasting far-left propaganda. Anyway, let's read, because this is quite fascinating. Quote, "Today the Brazilian embassy in Wellington was occupied by Organize Aotearoa, an emerging socialist organization based in Aotearoa, to protest against the newly inaugurated far-right Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro's first day in office. Activists occupied the embassy in solidarity with the people of Brazil." I would guess the 30% that didn't vote for Bolsonaro, right? Jair Bolsonaro controversially emerged victorious in Brazil's national elections last year despite huge public outcry. His plans to roll back protections of the Amazon forest and attacks on indigenous and LGBT rights in Brazil threaten working-class Brazilians. Organize Aotearoa whatever spokesperson Kat Buisink notes, quote, "It was important to occupy the embassy today because the Brazilian embassy in New Zealand represents a fascist government. We want to make it clear to the Brazilian regime that the people of Aotearoa do not accept fascism in any form, including a diplomatic presence." According to Buisink, political killings, beatings and hate crimes have been on the rise during Bolsonaro campaign perpetrated by his supporters. The new government encourages and enables this brutality both through policy and the actions of Bolsonaro personally. Already, Bolsonaro moved the responsibility for the demarcation of indigenous land to the Ministry of Agriculture, allowing it to be opened up for commercial land grabs, lowered the minimum wage, and abolished the public safety, social development, labor, culture, and environment ministries. The new Minister of Human Rights, Family and Women is opposed against abortion and sex education. So in addition to being idiots, these leftists are illiterate as well. Bolsonaro has also made comments which have been seen endorse violence against indigenous groups, women and the LGBT population. Christ almighty, these people are really illiterate. Organize out whatever, I don't really care about their places, calling for the expulsion of the Brazilian ambassador to New Zealand and the recall of the New Zealand ambassador to Brasilia. We occupied the embassy under a banner reading "No relations with fascist nations," and will continue to stand by this principle and resist the Brazilian government's presence in our territory. I mean, these people, when I read, especially given that the illiterate manner in which the press communique is written, these people remind me basically of the triggered leftists who went into full autistic screeching at the inauguration of President Donald Trump. Now, with that said, at least the American leftists and their European fans suck. They suck, of course, but they also stuck to street protests and didn't attempt to start, diplomatic conflicts. Now, since these ones didn't, I would seriously make the case that they be extradited to Brazil to serve jail time for their crime. Why? Because the territory of the embassy is sovereign Brazilian territory, and as such, their crimes should be judged under the Brazilian law. Now, nothing would be more progressive than for these clowns to serve 2 years in a Brazilian federal jail. And since that ambassador was likely appointed by the Dilma Rousseff administration anyway, Bolsonaro could and should do a great propaganda stunt and say, "Okay, fine, we'll recall our ambassador, and the ambassador should travel alongside the organized Aotearoa group," whatever. Because make no mistake, treating communists in any other way than with outright hostility is a huge mistake, one that Bolsonaro has shown he's not willing to make, and I can only hope and pray he will never make. Alright, now let's head to a whole list of stories from Canada, one more insane than the other, really. Most from the CBC, so I won't have whining Canadians in the comments complaining that I only quote from extremist websites. Although do keep in mind what I said last year in June. One step into Canada is enough to forever get in love with the United States of America. So, from the Canadian Brainwash Corporation, Safe Supply Program will distribute free opioids to entrenched users. 50 opioid users in Vancouver's downtown east side will regularly get pills to crush up and inject. Carissa Sutherland's history with drugs is a lot like many others in Vancouver's downtown east side. The 29-year-old started about 10 years ago with morphine and hydromorphone pills marketed under the brand name Dilaudid, or Dilly as it's known on the street. I kind of just progressed more and more, and then I couldn't get dillies very much, or they were more expensive than heroin, so that I ended up just doing heroin, said Sutherland, who soon added methamphetamine to the mix. Oh, that's such a lovely. For her, an especially low point came when she overdosed alone in a Wendy's bathroom about 2 years ago. Luckily, someone found her and her life was saved. Now, a safe supply program for people in Sutherland's situation is launching in the neighborhood. Operated by the Portland Hotel Society out of its Molson overdose prevention site, the pilot program will distribute free Dilaudid pills for 50 patients. The hydromorphone pills, which are manufactured to be taken orally, will be crushed up and rendered as an injectable drug, just like heroin. It's the first time in Canada that opioids will be prescribed in this way, and an idea that came directly from the street. Lovely. According to Cuckoo Culbertson, who is overseeing the program for PHS, the dosage will be prescribed by a physician, and participants will be able to get up to 5 doses per day to be injected under the supervision of PHS staff and volunteers. Culbertson said the pills, which are worth about 36 cents when bought legally, cost drug users $20 to $30 on the street. According to Sutherland, a user on the street can make up 4 or 5 pickups per day to support a habit, sometimes buying multiple pills each time. Sutherland's life has taken a dramatic turn for the better since her overdose. She's still a regular drug user, but for the past year and a half she's been injecting under supervision at Molson OPS. She quickly started volunteering there, and now Sutherland's on the payroll as a peer support worker. She's taken part in reversing dozens of potentially fatal overdoses. She's also found housing through PHS. But despite the more stable life, the drugs have still put her in risky situations. Sutherland is hoping that will disappear if she's accepted in the new Safe Supply program. I'm hoping that once I get on the Dilly program, I won't have to do that. I won't have to go boost from stores or steal from stores or sell things to get money to get drugs, she said. For her, she says, safe supply doesn't just mean drugs that won't contain unknown amounts of deadly fentanyl, it also means a drug supply that leads to a much safer lifestyle, close quote. A drug supply that leads to a much safer lifestyle? I'm sorry, what? I mean, perpetual drug supply and safer lifestyle are just mutually exclusive with any drug, but it is particularly and especially mutually exclusive with heroin. And it's shit like this why I'm quite ambivalent at best with the whole "oh, let's legalize drugs" narrative, because so far there have been exactly 0 successful cases of a jurisdiction legalizing drugs without offloading the cost upon the taxpayers. So while Sweden style or US style of war on drugs policies clearly don't work, it simply does not follow at all that using taxpayers' money to outright cater to the whims of the junkies is really such a good idea. And then there's also the hypocrisy factor. I mean, in Canada, in some provinces like Ontario for instance, you can get fined for smoking a cigarette on the sidewalk under the Ontario Smoke-Free Act of 2017. Now, of course, nobody actually enforces that because even most Canadians realize that such a provision is inherently insane, which I got to admit, it's quite a surprise given that the majority of the Canadian public isn't particularly known for sensible thinking on these issues. Yet in the exact same country, the taxpayers must produce the shekels to cater to the whims of heroin addicts. Basically, the smokers of normal cigarettes get overtaxed so that the heroin addicts get their shots for free. There is a name for that, and that name for that kind of policy is backwardness. Now, sadly, this is not just an isolated Canada type of insanity. Such insanity exists in many US jurisdictions too, and most notably in Portugal. None had any success with these kinds of policies because, as it turns out, junkies gonna junkie. And just because you give them their shots for free in a safe environment just doesn't magically fix all the character flaws that turn marginal users into entrenched addicts. And this is relevant because these programs are targeting entrenched addicts, meaning individuals who are deeply irresponsible with money and deeply irresponsible in general. I mean, even the woman that they use in this particular article, and they cite her as their success story, is still a total train wreck. She's been given a job and subsidized housing, and she still gets into trouble and steals from shops and so on and so forth. And apparently admitting to these crimes on national media is still fine and dandy, instead of, sending the police after her and putting her where she belongs. But then again, women in Canada don't go to jail even when they hire hitmen to kill other people. So of course, this dangerous junkie would never see the inside of a prison cell. And this is why we can't have nice things, because even calling a spade is now hate speech. Well, it is in Canada, not here, so for now I can still do this show. Alright, let's get to the next piece of, I hope, still Canadian insanity. Yep, there we go. Via Global News, police in Canada can now demand breath samples in bars and at home. It may sound unbelievable, but Canada's revised laws on impaired driving could see police demand breath samples from people in bars, restaurants, or even at home. And if you say no, you could be arrested, face a criminal record, ordered to pay a fine, and subjecting to a driving suspension. You could be in violation of the impaired driving laws even 2 hours after you've been driving. Now, the onus is on the drivers to prove they weren't impaired when they were on the road. It's ridiculous. It's basically criminalizing you having a drink at your kitchen table, Paul Doroshenko, a Vancouver criminal defense lawyer who specializes in impaired driving cases, told the Global News. If you start to drink after you get home, the police show up at your door, they can arrest you, detain you, take you back to the police station, and you can be convicted because your blood alcohol concentration was over 80 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood in the 2 hours after you drove. Changes to Section 253 of the Criminal Code of Canada took effect in December, giving police greater powers to seek breath samples from drivers who might be driving while impaired. Under the new law, police officers no longer need to have a reasonable suspicion the driver had consumed alcohol. Now, an officer can demand a sample from drivers for any reason at any time. While many Canadians have heard about that part of the new legislation, lawyers said the 2-hour provision has gone unreported. The public has completely missed this one, said Joseph Neuberger, a Toronto criminal defense lawyer. He described a scenario in which someone has gone home and watches a hockey game, enjoys a few beers, and gets a knock on the door from police, who received a tip about someone in the house who was driving a vehicle suspiciously. The person answers the door and they say, "Sir, we've got a complaint about your driving. We need you to provide a sample," said Neuberger, noting if the person failed to provide the sample, it would likely lead to arrest. "It's a serious erosion of civil liberties," said Toronto criminal defense lawyer Michael Engel, whose practice focuses almost exclusively on impaired driving cases. Engel said someone could be unjustly prosecuted if a disgruntled business associate or spouse called police with a complaint and an officer went to investigate at the person's home or place of business. Police could demand a breath sample. Husbands or wives in the course of separations would drop the dime on their partner, Engel said, describing the potential of the law's abuse by those calling the police out of spite, for example. In an instance where someone was drinking in a public place, Doroshenko said it would be hard for someone to prove they weren't impaired when they were driving earlier. If the police come and find you at the restaurant, they can take you out of the restaurant despite of the fact that you've been drinking at the restaurant. Maybe you weren't going to drive away, he said, arguing the rules are excessive. It is profoundly stupid, so most people assume it can't be. But that's what the law is now. You will see it happen, I guarantee it. The federal government brought in the revised law in an effort to reduce fatalities on the roads, close quote. Now, I love it how this lawyer just assumes that something so alien as civil liberties even exist in Canada. Which is funny because the only non-leftists who are able to tell me stories about Canada actually having any civil liberties were very old Canadians, like older than 60 or preferably 75 or older. Nevertheless, the state will now effectively criminalize any and all alcohol consumption if you also happen to own a car, but at the same time will pay for heroin for entrenched addicts. Now, isn't Canada such an awesome and civilized place? The lawyer is correct, though, in pointing out the potential for this law to be used by, well, he says spouses, but what he means is women, because the gynocentric courts of Canada always believe women, even when it's proven beyond any reasonable doubt that they're full of shit. Now, later in the article, the government official defend this lunacy by claiming this is modernizing the criminal justice system and arguing that this lunacy exists in some form in 16 US states. Well, even if that were true, I don't know if it is, I haven't checked, the fact that it exists in 16 US states is not an argument. You know what else exists in all 50 US states? Freedom of speech. You know, something that doesn't exist in Canada. You know what else is banned in all 50 US states? The existence of hate speech tribunals. Just recently, the Supreme Court reaffirmed in a 9-0 that such thing as hate speech doesn't exist, no matter how offended the communists are. So if the Canadian Justice Minister is so keen on taking cues from US law, maybe starting with the unanimous stuff would be better rather than minority marginal stuff? Now, make no mistake, I have no personal stake in this. In fact, I hold quite a bit of disdain for both alcohol and cars. But the idea of the police being able to come to anyone's house and take breath samples 2 hours after that individual may or may not have driven the car to begin with, that is Soviet style of thinking. And to drive the Soviet analogy home, the idea that the police can arrest you in a restaurant while you're drinking because you might drive back home is the kind of thinking that used to happen in late 1980s during Mikhail Gorbachev's policy on the increased struggle against hard drinking and alcoholism. And I'm not joking, that was the name of the policy. And again, this is the most hypocritical when put in the wider context. I mean, if this policy had been enacted in Sweden, a war on drugs country, probably nobody would have noticed. But to enact this policy while at the same time facilitating much harder drugs, this basically sends the message that basic vices, such as cigarettes and alcohol, are to be treated as the utmost serious crimes, while the really serious and damaging vices are to be subsidized. You know what happens when you do this? You get more people hooked on the really serious and damaging vices. That's what happens. And then you'll be complaining of an ever higher opioid crisis, while at the same time patting yourselves on the back for reducing smoking and alcohol consumption, while the zombies beat you up on the street for their next fix. Fucking genius, the whole lot. You know what else is genius policy? Kicking out people from their duly rented house because they're not related to each other. It happens to Canada, of course. 7 roommates forced out of 7-bedroom house because they're not related, titles the CBC. University of Victoria student Emma Edmonds never expected she'd have to speak before the District of Saanich Council. But after Edmonds and her 6 roommates were told they were being evicted due to a Saanich bylaw, which limits the number of unrelated people living in a house to 4 individuals, she decided she had to do something. Dressed in a black blazer, the soon-to-be evicted 21-year-old made her case to council earlier this week, saying the bylaw needs to be updated. The whole process has been a pretty awful experience, said Edmonds, who's studying political science and living on southern Vancouver Island. I just felt that even if we couldn't save our own house, it's really important that we make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, because what's happening to us is legal, and that's the problem. Edmonds told CBC's On the Island host Gregor Craigie that the house she's being evicted from has 7 bedrooms and plenty of space for the tenants. She adds that when they moved in at the beginning of September, they were never told about the bylaw. But on December the 5th, 2018, the women were informed they needed to be out by the end of January. Edmonds says half of the women have found new places to rent, while the rest are still searching in a district with a rental vacancy rate of 1.6%, according to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And Edmonds picked the interest of Councillor Zach DeVry, who's recently graduated from the University of Victoria, is preparing to present an amendment to the bylaw. This is a blanket policy that is too constrictive, said DeVry. It's not really respective of the vast difference in housing sizes. He believes the maximum number of unrelated people living in one house should be scaled to the number of legal bedrooms. And while he notes the bylaw is a big issue for students trying to secure affordable housing in a difficult market, he says it also applies to other renters in the community. It's holding back the housing stock, said DeVry. He says a district bylaw should not discriminate against people simply because they are unrelated, close quote. Now, I will never understand for the life of me why such laws exist in the first place. And no, I don't give a shit about the petty justifications of either safety or my neighbors. It's not and must not be the privilege of the state to decide who and how many people live on a private property, period. Now, luckily, these individuals have vaginas, which means they'll be taken somewhat seriously, but not by much. In the sense that they'll probably amend the bylaw a little bit instead of doing what must be done, namely to abolish the nonsense altogether. Now, these kinds of regulations are not only absurd and totalitarian in nature, but they also harm exactly the kind of people the leftists claim to support. If you remember, last year there was the case in Chicago where the Good Samaritan was housing homeless people for free in his house because otherwise those people would have literally frozen to death. But the city hall outright told them that it is preferable for homeless people to freeze to death outside than for their precious building code to be rightfully ignored. These kinds of regulations are essentially worse than the Soviet Union. I mean, Nikita Khrushchev himself wasn't so bloody insane as to purport to dictate how many people are allowed to live in a household. And the homeless example doesn't come randomly because bylaws like these essentially create homelessness. And while you can say that this is just a town, in the comments section multiple people point out that this is endemic in both Canada and the United Kingdom. And this wouldn't be such a terrible problem if those rules would have been enforced by a private homeowners association or some other voluntary arrangement. But to have the taxpayers pay for evicting youngsters simply for breathing while being unrelated, that, my fellow deplorables, is insane. Alright, enough with Canadian insanity. Let's get to more general type of insanity, such as misandrist propaganda from the Pravda on Hudson. Considering firing your mail broker, titles the New York Times, a former newspaper. I won't be reading the full misandrist manifesto, but let me read you what is the latest trend in, well, they say it's thought, in the toilet paper on record. Quote, when people picture a financial advisor, they typically think of a gray-haired guy who looks like Bernie Madoff, or perhaps a younger man like Leonardo DiCaprio's character in The Wolf of Wall Street. The imagined portrait rarely resembles someone like me, a woman, and that underlying perception is fairly accurate. Roughly less than 20% of financial advisors are women, a number that has barely budged for the last 2 decades despite rising gender equity in other fields. But what has this overwhelmingly male workforce accomplished? Banks and brokerage firms consistently rank rock bottom on lists of the most beloved companies and brands, and not by coincidence. A major basis of the distrust is rampant conflicts of interest. In 2015, the Department of Labor estimated that the cost of conflicted investment advice for retirement savers is more than $17 billion per year. Then there are the roots of the financial crisis last decade, several of which can be traced to advisors convincing clients that investing in high-risk subprime mortgages was a safe bet. While neither sex is immune to shoddy behavior, research has shown that female investors are more likely than men to focus on a family's financial goals over their own absolute investment performance. A study by the Warwick Business School concluded that women outperformed men at investing by 1.8%. For one, women avoid lottery-style trading and are more likely to focus on shares with good track records or on overlooked yet productive funds. Close quote. Okay. First of all, it's not clear. 1.8% per what? Per decade, per year, per month, per day? Because if it's per decade, then that is huge and significant. If it's per year, it might be an accident and it sure needs control for sampling. If it's per month, it literally doesn't matter. Now, if we click on the original study, we see it's a sampling of 2,800 investors, and it's only for a 3-year period, which was a period in which large cap funds outperformed smaller ones by 1.5% a year. If the exact same study would have looked at the period between 2013 and 2015, the results would have been entirely the opposite, because in that period the smaller ones outperformed the larger ones. So by the logic of this author and this study, in 2013-2015, one should have considered firing their female broker. And again in 2018, small caps outperformed, so once again, let's fire all the women. Or maybe, just maybe, don't make huge leaps of logic based on limited and partially flawed data to make your sexist case? Maybe? Well, not in the current year and not in the New York Times, because the former newspaper is busy demonizing men. Quote, Claire Francis, a director of the Barclays Smart Investor, agreed with the researchers who attributed the difference in performance to women's judiciousness. The stock market is often portrayed as a high-energy, risky environment, she said, but this analysis shows that taking a more long-term view about what to invest in rather than picking eye-catching and potentially more volatile shares is actually likely to provide a better return on your money. In one of my favorite papers, Boys Will Be Boys, published by the Quarterly Journal of Economics, Terence O'Dean at UC Berkeley and Brad Barber at UC Davis found that accounts owned by women outperformed those of men because women traded at a whopping 69% less than men and incurred less in trading costs. Why did the men trade more? The research indicates men regularly exhibit overconfidence in their ability. Christine Lagarde, chairwoman of the International Monetary Fund, was one of many world leaders to remark that the 2008 crisis might have never happened if there had been more women in high-ranking positions to pull the reins on the testosterone-tinged frenzy. Instead, all told, $19.2 trillion of household wealth was lost in America alone. I mean, this is really funny. Christine Lagarde has the gall to talk about this? I mean, let us not forget, Christine Lagarde is the incompetent woman who got there by burying her much more competent competition, namely Dominique Strauss-Kahn, whose career has been ruined by a carefully manufactured false rape accusation. Sure, Strauss-Kahn won every single battle in court and was entirely acquitted, but in return, France got Monsieur Hollande and his hate taxes, which is arguably one of the many reasons there's trouble in France right now. Again, don't get me wrong. Dominique Strauss-Kahn is a filthy degenerate, which, by the way, he admits it himself too. And a socialist, though a socialist less insane than François Hollande for sure. So it's not like I wouldn't prefer both Dominique Strauss-Kahn and Christine Lagarde to be falling from the helicopter. But when all is said and done, Christine Lagarde is and was less than Strauss-Kahn in terms of competence. As a result, having Christine Lagarde opine on anything really is laughable. Also, the IMF under her really looks like someone needs to pull the reins on the estrogen-tinged frenzy that she brought into the institution, turning the place even more into a laughing stock. Not that the IMF hadn't been cancer before her tenure anyway. Alright, here's a funnier one. Parents' horror at Kinder Egg toys with Donald Trump hair holding KKK balloons. Title Metro UK. The makers of Kinder Surprise Eggs have apologized to horrified parents after toys their children were given inside the chocolate treats were branded with the letters KKK. One mother said she was left feeling sick after noticing the letters had been painted onto 3 balloons being held by a Kinder character, the same letters to identify the notorious white supremacist group Ku Klux Klan. Kimberly from Victoria, Australia, said she initially laughed in shock at the toy, but then quickly realized the serious implications it could have. No, you didn't give a shit. She said her 15-month-old son Alexander was not able to read what was on the toy, but she feared it could have been a deliberate move. No, you didn't. This is a massive oversight that anyone could have seen, Kimberly said. She added it raises questions as to what the company supports and if this is subliminal marketing. Conspiratorial thinking on the left is rampant these days. Another mom, Liz Cameron, pointed out the toy also had similarities to US President Donald Trump, who has in the past been accused of supporting far-right views, of course. She wrote on Twitter, "My son got this as the toy in a Kinder Surprise chocolate egg. White pointy-shaped character, Donald Trump hair, KKK balloons. Make chocolate great again." So that's what you do these days with a toy you don't like. Just post it on Twitter and virtue signal. You know what? I miss the old days when if we find a toy that we didn't like, we just throw it in the garbage disposal and that's it. Oh, but only after we ate the chocolate, of course. The insanity part here does not come from Kinder, but from the perpetually offended snowflakes. For starters, you would have to be insane to be in Australia, and instead of thinking about how your kid is having fun, you're thinking about political symbols that are not even there, and who resemble, maybe, with something on the other end of the world where Kinder eggs are banned anyway. Secondly, since when did the KKK wear blue balloons? Also, we could argue that the figurine resembles Bill Clinton from the political party that actually founded the KKK. But then again, virtue signalers on Twitter aren't particularly known for their engagement in this highly dangerous activity, occasionally known as thinking. And finally, one could just move on. Let the kid have the chocolate, play with the toy for 2 days, and that's it. The kid will be bored with the toy in no time anyway. Seriously, the leftists are sucking all the fun out of being a kid. Now, speaking about sucking all the fun out of being a kid, let's go to the recurring theme here on Periodic Insanity, the usage of children for sexual purposes and for LGBT propaganda. 10-year-old boy drag kid photographed with naked adult drag queen, titles the Daily Wire. And I will read this in its entirety, slowly. And I'll try not to get infuriated while reading it. See, this is me trying. Nobody talks about how many lives were saved because the first instinct was to light up a cigarette instead of punching someone in the face. Quote, on Monday, 10-year-old Canadian boy Nemis Queen Melanson Golden was featured in a troubling Huck magazine piece highlighting the life of a so-called child drag queen. Young Nemis, whose drag name is Queen Lactatia, was shot by photographer Jonathan Frederick Turton for the spread. In one of the shots that did not make the magazine, Nemis, in full drag makeup and a black dress, is posing for a photo with Season 7 winner RuPaul's Drag Race, Violet Chachki. In the shocking photo, Violet is wearing nothing but a pair of heels and a small piece of fabric covering his genitals, as seen in the screenshot below. Interviewed and photographed, Queen Lactatia for Huck magazine about life as a child drag queen posted Turton on Twitter. Turton, according to his website, is a multimedia content producer with specialisms in photography, videography, and journalism. He claims to have shot for mainstream outlets and businesses like the BBC, Adidas, Dazed and Confused magazine, and the Discovery Channel. In the jarring Huck magazine piece, which ironically bashes Daily Wire editor-in-chief Ben Shapiro for calling out parents for over-sexualizing their drag kids, Nemis's mother, Jessica Melanson, conceded that drag has a sexual component and is unapologetic about her young son wearing sexually suggesting clothing if it makes him feel beautiful. Drag is an adult arena, and that's where people question our judgment, concedes Jessica. So we have to censor things. He knows there are adult aspects of drag that he's not allowed to apply to his show. We would never try to overtly sexualize our child. But if he wears something that makes him feel beautiful, what right do I have to stop him wearing that dress because it might cause people to think things that they shouldn't be thinking? It's a circular problem. In 2017, Nemis appeared on stage with popular drag queen Bianca Del Rio at a drag show his mother brought him to. The clip of the two on stage together, wherein the drag queen repeatedly uses the word bitch and drops an F-bomb, quickly went viral. That video happened and everyone went crazy, Jessica recalled. But we knew from the get-go we never wanted to lose control or lose sight of it being fun for Nemis. According to Jessica, drag is how Nemis chooses to express himself. He's just a kid playing. There's so much more going on in the world right now which is more horrifying and terrifying than my child wearing fancy shoes and a skirt. This shouldn't be on anyone's list of priorities, she added. Nemis also appears to already be an LGBT advocate. Choose love, be proud, smash the patriarchy, and be kind to one another always. Hashtag pride, hashtag love no not hate, hashtag love is love, hashtag non-binary, and hashtag the future is fluid, reads a post on the boy's Instagram account, which is said to be run by his mother. In December, an 11-year-old named Desmond Naples performed a sexually suggestive musical number in full drag at a New York City-based gay bar called the $3 Bill. The boy received dollar bills from the adult males in the audience, as one might see in a strip club. As reported by the Daily Wire, Desmond, otherwise known as Desmond is Amazing, was dressed as a Gwen Stefani look-alike. Full drag makeup, a blonde wig, and crop top included, as he bounced around on stage to No Doubt's Just a Girl and collected dollar bills from male adults viewing the number. Close quote. Now, you tell me that these people shouldn't be boarding the helicopter. I mean, seriously. You tell me that these things, legally called parents, are people to begin with. Because I don't generally tend to regard pedos as actual people. And I've been called an extremist a bajillion times because of that. But I'd rather be an extremist if the alternative is to tolerate such huge levels of child abuse. I mean, who in his right mind thinks this is acceptable? What parent thinks this is acceptable? And the defense of the, oh, but it makes him feel beautiful, is like the old joke with the vegan cat. We all know who is making the decisions. Also, nice deflection from there from the mother. What right do I have to stop him wearing that dress because it might cause people to think things they shouldn't be thinking? It's a circular problem. This is as if it's the dress to which normal people are objecting to primarily. But it isn't. We're not objecting to the dress, ma'am. And while it is true you can't control what other people think or whether they might think things they shouldn't, it doesn't change the fact that you, as a mother, are facilitating it. It's one thing to play dress up at home or with a neighbor or with a friend somewhere in the neighborhood, but it's a whole different ballgame to play dress up in a bar while adults are throwing dollar bills at you. Or in this case, taking photographs with naked adults and parading it all over the internet and naughty, glossy magazines. For normal people, these things are not on the same level, but for the mother, who must be either evil or suffering from a serious mental disorder, maybe Munchausen's by proxy. Anyway, for this individual who is still allowed to call herself a mother, is all the same. And once again, this wouldn't be a serious issue if it were one or two marginal cases appearing in a local magazine, but it's not. There's a whole industry out there of so-called child drag, where gender confusion is encouraged, and to make things worse, the state, especially far leftist activist judges, punish the parents who want to prevent that. Just last year, a judge literally took a minor away from the family because the family believed in biology and not Tumblr make-believe claptrap. This is dangerous. Now, there are basically two ways for how this will end. The very likely way that all of these parents and doctors and perhaps even judges who allowed and even encouraged this insanity to happen will be sued into oblivion once all of these kids become adults and realize that they've been exploited for a larger agitprop operation, which also happened to be very profitable for some of its higher ideologues and practitioners. And the less likely way that all of this will just fade away. The second is possible but not probable based on the previous examples of kids used in propaganda. For instance, those of you older on the internet might remember the little Hercules, the kid born in Ukraine who was a sensation in the bodybuilding world. As it turns out, it was his abusive father who was making the decisions, and the wonder kid of those times is now in his late 20s and doesn't work out at all and doesn't care at all about the topic. The problem is that in these current cases, the situation is far worse. While in the little Hercule case, the legacy of that childhood is a slightly higher competitiveness and some viral pictures and clips with him working out, with these kids, the legacy will be pictures of them sissified and pictures of them as children next to naked adults for the gratification of pedophiles. This can have an enormous impact on these kids when they will enter adulthood, and not really in a good way. And all for what? So that mommy can feel good and perhaps draw some income from it? Because don't tell me this is all passion. Only the gear for the drag stuff can get pretty bloody expensive. Someone is paying for that. And perhaps it wouldn't be a terrible idea if those who pay for this would be, how do you say it in internet terms? Doxed? I don't really like this term, doxed, as if it's something bad. I believe it is and should be a matter of public knowledge who pays to have pictures of children with naked adults, and who pays to have children in bars dancing for the delight of adult patrons. Some countries insist on the state knowing who does perfectly legal activities like watching porn or gambling one's own money. Yet for some reason it's immoral to want to know who sponsors activities whose legality should be questioned. This is truly an insane world indeed. Alright. Any other? No, that's it for now. I have plenty of material for at least 2 more episodes, which I'll be taping right away, though you'll probably see them in the next several days because it takes a while to edit and render and publish and all the rest. I also might have scheduled them at some distance from each other simply because I have way too many things on my plate, and now it's nice to have videos published while I'm doing something else, and by something else I mean being in Zimbabwe. I don't know exactly when this will publish, but I'm either already in Zimbabwe or getting ready to go when you're watching this. So please give shekels because that's pretty expensive, and getting footage from there is not particularly easy. It involves a risk. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. Please do subscribe to my social media. Check out the website, freedomalternative.com, for more updates, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.